Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Bet. Today's stuff is sponsored by Miki Kaddish in loving memory of her father, Daniel Hirsch. Okay, welcome to Masechet Menachot. New Masechet, somewhat new, somewhat familiar. You'll see from, like we said, the first daf is going to be very similar to the first daf of Zvachim. We're still in the same world of the temple. So first of all, Mazal Tov to all those who finished Zvachim, or if you didn't finish yet, or if you're new to Daf Yomi, so welcome to Daf Yomi. Might be not the easiest place to start, but it is going to be an interesting Masechet where we're going to learn a whole world where, I feel like even if we were brought up understanding the basics of some stuff about korbanot, even though many of us really don't know so much about korbanot, but animal sacrifices, for sure the details of the mincha offerings are much less known to everybody. We're going to learn how many different types of menachot are. You might be surprised by the sheer number of different types of menachot that there are. I'll just throw out some numbers. If we categorize them, and you can listen to Ayelet Hoffman-Lipson's shir, Introduction to Masechet Menachot, which you can find on our daf. The intros, by the way, are now found on every page of every daf of the Masechet. You can always go from the very top to listen to the intro, which is actually a great feature because sometimes the intro, as I always say, is much more useful once you're already in the middle of the Masechet and you've already learned things. Then the intros are useful to give perspective on what you've learned. It's kind of hard in the beginning. It's helpful to have an introduction, but it means a lot more if you listen again in the middle. But there's different ways to categorize them. I want to just categorize them in this way right now, just to give you a bit of a insight into Menachot. There's 11 korbanot yachid, the mincha offerings by individuals. You can count them as 9, you can count them as 11. We'll talk about it right now. There's 3 communal ones. So some are brought by the community as a whole, and those are on special days of the year, which is, well, the lechem hapanim is every week. It's a type of mincha offering. You might not have known that, but it is. The shtei lechem, which is brought on Shavuot, and the omer mincha offering, which is brought with the korban omer on the day after the first day of Pesach. There's also libations, which are brought with a certain korbanot, and with those are mincha offerings. Minchatam v'nizkehem k'medubar. We say it in our davening all the time. We don't always necessarily pay attention to that. So there's communal, there's ones that are brought with korbanot, which, by the way, are communal and individual, and then there's ones that are individuals. Now, the individual also breaks into 2. The individual splits into ones that are voluntary offerings, just like we saw with regular korbanot, and obligatory offerings. Okay, we're going to get into what all the obligatory ones, the 2 that can kind of go either way, or it depends where you classify them, but they're ones that actually come with korbanot, but they're specifically korbanot that come in for particular reasons, like a Thanksgiving offering has 40 loaves of bread that come with it. And the Nazir breads, the Nazir has to bring also breads with one of his korbanot. So those are individual, really, we would call them, and that gets the number up to 11, okay? Because we have 5 that are voluntary, we have 4 that are obligatory, which is the minchat choteh and knaot, which we're going to talk about very shortly, so I'm not even going to talk about them. And there's the chavitin and the chinuch. The chinuch is the one, the Kohen, the first day he goes to work on the job, he brings a minchat chinuch. And the Kohen Gadol every day brings a minchat chavitin. So they're individual offerings, but they're also of a bit of a different sort because they're for the Kohanim specifically relating to their job. Okay, that's a little bit of what Menachot are. If you want to know the exact order of the chapters and what we're going to be doing, so again, Ayelet discussed it, but I'll say it very briefly, which is we're starting off the same way we start in Zvachim, in a very seemingly strange way, but it actually is the way many of the Masechtot start out, with all the mess ups, okay? The ways that you can ruin something, instead of starting where I might have thought to start a book with, okay, here are the rules. Now, this is what happens if you do them wrong. No, we start with, what if you do it wrong? I'll give you another example, like sukkah. Sukkah starts out, a sukkah that's 20 cubits high is disqualified. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, but basically it's all about disqualification rather than how do you build a sukkah? What are the criteria? What do you need? Okay, it's an interesting way to start. Why this is, now this is in the Mishna, right? This isn't the Gemara. The Mishna started out that way, and then the Gemara just discusses the Mishna. Why the Mishna did that is an excellent question, and there's different theories about it, but I'm going to leave it as an open question. So we're going to start off with all the disqualifications. We're going to end with what are the rules for all the different Menachot. In the middle, we end up with this interesting section, which makes Menachot a little bit more relevant, where we're going to talk about mezuzah and tefillin and tzitzit. So we're going to get into all sorts of other mitzvot. We'll see how that all connects later. So without any more introduction, I want to say one more thing that's really important to know. And again, you can hear this all in Ayel's introduction. She goes into these things more in depth and kind of gives a good perspective on it. But all Menachot are Kodshei Kodeshim, which is very interesting because it puts them, okay, by the way, there's an intro of Ayel and there's also an excellent intro of Alana Steinhain, which is all about like what is a korban mincha, how does it compare to animal sacrifices. Very, very interesting shiur as well. So those are both, as I would say, almost obligatory, right? If we're talking about voluntary, obligatory, I would say those are, worth listening to before or once starting to engage in this Masechet. So all Menachot are Kodshei Kodeshim, which is actually kind of strange because you would think a mincha is less sanctified because the whole idea is, if you're poor, right, you're going to bring this. It's just, right, it's definitely the poor man's or a poor woman's offering, and yet it's always Kodesh Kodeshim. So it has a higher level of sanctity than some of the other korbanot. What does it mean it's high level sanctity? So there's two types. Either some are completely burned, and some are you burn the kemitza. Remember that? You take the handful. We're going to talk about exactly how you do that. But the 3 middle fingers of the Kohen, dips them in. It's called a handful, even though it's not a full handful. And then that part gets burned on the altar. And if you remember, the shirayim, the remainder of that actually is eaten by the Kohen. So the Kohen gets the bulk of the korban. And, right, just like the sin offering, the guilt offering, and in Zvachim, where the animal's slaughtered, the meat goes to the Kohen, and just some of the parts get burned on the altar. Okay? So that's your classic Kodshei Kodeshim, right? Either like an Ola where the whole thing is burnt. So we have those two types of mincha, but none of them are Kodshim Kalim. Okay, let's get started. So the Mishna starts out with Kol ha-menachot shenikmitzu shelo lishman kshirot. So here we already start talking about disqualifications or things that are okay, but we're going to see in a minute, not fully okay. So you take a mincha and nikmitzu. Now, here we're going to learn that there's parallel, and we learned this already in Zvachim. All the main 4 actions, slaughtering, right? This is in an animal sacrifice, slaughtering, collecting the blood, walking the blood to the altar, where that actually we had a big machloket. Was it the central avoda or not? And are all things disqualified there like the others? But let's just keep going. Walking it to the mizbech, bringing the blood to the altar, and then putting the blood on the altar. Those are the 4 actions in an animal sacrifice. They're the critical actions that we spent a long time in the beginning of our Masechet explaining. These things have to be done lishma, l'shem this korban. We had all these psukim that proved it and everything there. How we know that each of these 4 actions have to be done with the right intent, right? We started out all about intention, how important intention is. You might remember that we talked about a machloket, a very basic machloket, which is the same machloket here when we talk about lishma, which is Rashi and Tosfot and some others think that when we talk about lishma, your thoughts, we don't just mean your thoughts, it means thoughts that you expressed. If you didn't express them, they're meaningless. If you express them, that's when we start talking about could this disqualify or not. Whereas the Rambam and the Ritva and others basically say, no. We mean just in your thoughts alone, you can ruin things. Same issue here, right? What do we mean when we say lishma? Is it something you just think in your mind? Now here, by the way, it has to be the Kohen. We talked about there, maybe it's the owners, because it says, although it looks like, I think it would have to be the Kohen, right? Rashi says it, by the way, okay, if you look here, you have it explicitly. Rashi, okay, look at the first Rashi, okay, so you said, I'm going to bring a minchat marcheshet. We'll talk about that in a minute, what that is. You bring it, and the Kohen says, I'm doing this kemitza for the wrong korban, for a machvat instead of a marcheshet. So maybe I'll tell you right now what these are so you don't just think these are strange words. Machvat, by the way, is a modern Hebrew word for a frying pan. Okay, so a machvat is a pan. It's a flat pan, like a frying pan, where usually the mincha is going to come out hard because you're going to have some oil and then it gets crispy. Okay, the marcheshet is a deeper pan. And because it's deeper, the mincha is softer because it ends up being thicker and softer. And the marcheshet is a softer one. So you say you're going, and these are all different kinds of voluntary minchas that someone could bring. Okay, the main sections, by the way, you might want to read up on them, where it talks about the minchas in chapter 2 and chapter 6 of Vayikra. Okay, Alana actually talks about why is it in chapter 2. It's a very strange location. Because, first of all, why is it in 2 places? Because you might know this, you might not. I think we discussed it in Tzfachim a little bit. But the first few chapters of, until Parshat Tzav, basically Parshat Vayikra, are all the commandment to the people. If you want to bring this korban, you want to bring that korban, you want to bring that korban. in chapter 6, it turns to the Kohanim. Vayitzav et Kohanim. And there it goes through all the same korbanot again, but from the perspective of the Kohanim. Okay, so that's the two sections. That's why it appears twice. But the what's really strange is the placement of it in between the Ola and the Shlamim. Right? You would think you do all the animal and then you get to the mincha. So she suggests something by Yonatan Grossman. Anyway, you can listen to her shiur in here. Why it appears in chapter 2. Okay, let's get back to our topic. So any mincha shenikmitzu, and the commentaries say not just kemitza, or we're actually going to see this later in the Mishna, or we're going to see natan b'kli, or you put it in the sanctified vessel, which is part of the avodot you're supposed to do. It's like kabbalat hadam, like accepting the blood, right? Each of these actions, the 4 actions we talked about in the sacrifice, are going to have a parallel in the world of mincha. So the world of mincha, by the way, yes, it's good to mention this, and it definitely, if you have time, since I learned Zvachim last time, I've been dying to read that book. I have it on my shelf and haven't spent enough time on it yet. But there's a book of Yonatan Grossman called Zot Torat HaKorbanot, I think. It's an excellent book on Sefer Vayikra, basically, and the Korbanot. So, highly recommended. That's where Alana took her ideas from. Some of them. Okay, so the Menachot shenikmitzu shelo lishman. So we have shchita is like kemitza. Because what's kemitza? It's separating part from the other part and taking the main part that you're going to do something with, which is the kometz, that you're going to burn, which is similar to taking the blood out of the animal, which you're going to put on the altar. Notice the difference, right? First of all, there's no slaughtering, there's no blood that's going to even go on the altar because there is no blood in a meal offering. Instead, it's going to be the burning. Remember, the burning of the animal, those parts is not as significant. But in the mincha, that's the main part, burning the kometz. Okay, then we have, or burning, the whole thing when there is no kemitza. But in this case, we're talking about kemitza. There's putting it in the sanctified vessel. Then, right, which we actually had a whole discussion about, these nisachim in the midbar, and whether they're klei sharet or not klei sharet. Could you have done a mincha without klei sharet? But obviously in the temple you're doing it, it has to go in that sanctified vessel. Then we're going to have, you walk it to the altar, and then you burn it. So those are the 4 main actions. There's one big difference, by the way, also, which is a chumrah, a stringency by a mincha. The kometz can only be done by a kohen, whereas shchita, if you remember, can be done by non-kohenim, can be done by women, okay? You don't have that in a mincha. Everything's done by the kohen. So now we have a mincha shenikmitzu shelo lishman. Okay, it's been hard to get through this first line. We're almost there. Kshirot. So it's actually valid. What does it mean it's valid? Well, it's not completely valid, but ela shelo alu lebalim l'shem chova. But they actually did not fulfill the obligation of the owner. Exactly like we saw in Zvachim. If you remember, you can do a korban, if you do a korban shelo lishma, so it's kasher, which basically means, if you go ahead and do the rest of the actions, the kohen can eat the remainder, right? And you can continue to do the actions. You don't have to stop right there because you ruined it, okay? But, except for 2 exceptions to the rule, just like in Zvachim, we had 2 exceptions to the rule, which was the chatat, the sin offering, and the Pesach on the day of Pesach. Chutz minchat chotei and minchat knaot. There's 2 exceptions to the rule. The minchat chotei, remember what that is? That's the korban olevi orei, the sliding scale offering, which we learned about many times, which is, if you accidentally go into the temple when you're tamei, or you ate sacrificial meat when you were tamei, or you didn't realize the meat was tamei and you ate it, or shvuat bito, you promised and swore took an oath you were going to do something and then you didn't do it, or you weren't going to do something and you did it. Or shvuat ha'edu, which is you claim I stole something, I swear I didn't steal it, and then I later come and I admit, I did steal it. Okay? So that's a minchat chotei. Now, what does it mean? It's a sliding scale offering. So it starts with, really, you're supposed to bring animals. If you can't, an animal offering. If you can't afford an animal, you bring 2 birds. If you can't afford the bird, then you bring the meal offering. So that would be a case where it's like a chatat, basically. Okay? I see you're asking about what it's definitely not meat, the meal offering. The meal offering, we're going to see what it's made of. It's all flour, some sort of fine flour, usually wheat, sometimes barley. That leads us to the minchat kno, which is made of barley. And usually it has oil, and then it's brought also with frankincense, although some come without oil, some come without frankincense. There's different rules. Minchat knaot is the mincha that you have to bring along when the sotah is basically brought to the temple, so they also have to bring a meal offering. Okay, the husband actually offers the meal offering, called the minchat knaot. It seems similar because it's like a sin also, or related to a possible sin. But those two cannot be brought shelo lishma. So they're completely disqualified. Minchat chotei, minchat kneot shkmatzan shelo lishman. So now we're going to see if you did the kemitza of the minchat chotei, or the minchat kneot shelo lishman, or natam b'kli, or hilech v'ktir shelo lishman. This is why I told you later in the Mishna we're going to see all those 4 actions, which are presumably the same in the first part of the Mishna. They just didn't mention them. But also the kinds that are kasher, just don't fulfill the obligation for the owner, are also all those 4 actions, even though the Mishna specifically said nikmitzu. Lishman v'shelo lishman, or shelo lishman v'lishman. Not only if they were done shelo lishman, but if they were done half of it shelo lishman, meaning either you started out lishman and then while you were continuing, you said, I'm doing this for the sake of the wrong korban, or you started out with the wrong korban and then switched to the right korban. Either which way, if you had at any point a thought within the action of doing a shelo lishman, psula, it's completely disqualified if it's minchat chotei or minchat knaot. Ketzad lishman v'shelo lishman. So what would be a case? Now they want to spell it out for you. How would it be lishma v'shelo lishman? L'shem minchat chotei or l'shem minchat nedava. Okay, so you started out l'shem minchat chotei, which was lishma, and then in the middle of the kemitza, you said, I'm doing this l'shem minchat nedava, for a voluntary offering, which is not what it was meant to be. That would be disqualified. What would be shelo lishman or lishman? The exact reverse. Okay, you're not sure why the Mishna is actually spelling everything out here. But l'shem minchat nedava or l'shem minchat chotei. So you start off at the minchat nedava and then you move to the minchat chotei. A few things before we start the Gemara. First of all, in Zvachim, we had a very long discussion in the number of dapim in the beginning about what's the source in the Torah for all these laws of lishma in all the 4 actions. Here we don't have that at all. And the commentaries, some of them say that basically they're learning it out from this one pasuk at the end, which we've seen a bunch of times already. At the very end of the section of the Korbanot in chapter 7, it says, Zot Torah, these are the rules la'olah, la-mincha, la-chatat, la-asham, v'la-miluim, v'la-zebach hashlamim. And it puts together the mincha with all the other offerings. And from there they say, the rules of lishma that we derived all there is the same for the mincha. Okay, that seems to be the base pasuk where it's learned from. Okay. Now, I think there was something else I wanted to add, but I don't remember right now. We'll go on, and if I remember it later, I'll add it later. So now the Gemara starts off with the exact same sugya that we saw at the beginning of Zvachim. And what's going to bother the Gemara right now is a very simple word. Okay? The Mishna reads like this. Let's go back to the first line. Kol menachot shenichmitzu shelo lishman kshirot. Ella, this word ella is going to basically be the main thing, except shelo alu l'balin l'shem chova. Now, to you and I, at least the way it seems to me anyway, it seems pretty clear that Ella is necessary, right? What's it telling you? Well, it's totally a good korban, but it doesn't fulfill the obligation of the owner, okay? That seems like the right way to write it. But the Gemara is bothered by that word. Lama l'minna Ella. Why does it need to say Ella? And what seems to, according to the commentators, it seems to be bothering them is the Mishna generally says things as concise as possible. So because of that, it could have just said, without this big word Ella, that's, 3 letters long, it's not such a big word, but it could have just said and you would have understood the same thing. Now maybe but is a better word, but you still would have understood it. It would have said, all the menachot that you did, shelo lishma, are good, and they don't fulfill the obligation. Again, let's just remind ourselves what this means. They don't fulfill the obligation. It basically means you're going to continue sacrificing the sacrifice as you did, this mincha offering, this meal offering, but the owner who promised, I'm going to bring this to the temple, now has to bring a new one instead. Okay? So, why did they use the word Ella? Litni v'lo alu l'balin l'shem chava. You could have just said it simply without adding any extra word, just one little letter, and, vit is one word, right? It's not even a 3-letter word like it is in English. It's one letter, vav, just say it. V'lo alu l'balin l'shem chava. So they say it must be coming to teach you something extra. Now, if you just said, and it doesn't fulfill their obligation, but it's kosher, right? So what would you assume? Okay, it's kosher. It means I go ahead with the rest of the steps, and I give the remainder to the Kohen, okay, and end at that. So what is this extra word coming to teach you? Something additional that you might not have thought, which is hakamash malan. It's exactly the same thing we learned in Zvachim. Hakamash malan. It teaches you leba'alim hu delo alu l'shem chova hamincha gufa kshera va'asur l'shanuya. It's true that it doesn't fulfill the obligation of the owner. However, you cannot change anything about it. Meaning, once you did it wrong, don't think, I could do the next part of the process. I could put it in the vessel with the wrong thought. As I started off, I took it was a mincha mercheshet, and I said instead I'm doing it in a machvat, and then I just can continue when I put in the vessel. I say, I'm also doing it l'shem machvat. Okay, once I mess it up, so who cares? It's already messed up. Well, you can't do that. Kid Rava, and it's like Rava said, the Amar Rava, Ola sheshachata shelo lishma, asur lizrok dama shelo lishma. If you do an ola and you slaughter it shelo lishma, you can't sprinkle the blood shelo lishma. Okay, and for all intents and purposes, not just a lishma disqualification, any disqualification. You might say, I can do pigul, I can do this, I can, it's already messed up, so who cares? You don't do that. Now, on what basis do we say this? So they bring Rava to support this. What do? We suggested maybe the word Ella is come and teach us something. Well, it's very nice. What, did we make this up? Well, they're telling you we didn't make it up. Rava says this halacha. So we're just going to connect this word Ella to that halacha of Rava and say, that must be coming to teach you what Rava says. So now the question is, where do we get this from? Like, what's the logic or the basis for this halacha? That once you mess it up, you can't continue to mess it up. You have to do it properly. Either we can prove this by logic, or we can prove it by a pasuk. We can use both. Okay, when we ended the Masechet Zvachim, we talked about the fact that they ended with this attempt to prove something logically, and then they proved it by a pasuk. Right, there's constantly in Zvachim this back and forth. We're going to prove this from logic. We're going to prove it from a pasuk. Often the pasuk wins out. Here we basically have both. Okay, and they're both going to say the same thing. Okay, just because you mess something up, does that mean you're allowed to keep messing it up? Right? I think it's like, I'm trying to think of it exactly, but 2 wrongs don't make a right. Okay, right? And don't keep going and doing wrongs just because you messed one thing up already. Let's find it from a pasuk. Okay, there's this pasuk with a bit of a problem in it. Keep your promises, what you express in words. And do like you made a vow to God, a nidava. Now it's very weird. It sounds like do like your vow said, which is bring your vow. But a nidava is not a neder. Now they're similar. They're both volunteering something. Since we're in the world of korbanot, let's talk about the difference between a neder and a nidava when it comes to sacrifices. I say I vow a neder that I'm going to bring something to the temple. That's saying I vow that I'm going to bring it. It's on me. So if I then designate an animal or a meal offering or something and it gets burned, ruined, destroyed, gone, lost, I have to bring another one in its place because I committed that myself I'm going to bring something. A nidava is where I say hare zo alai. This is going to be brought to the temple. Now if something gets ruined after I promised it to the temple, I can't bring it, so therefore I'm no longer obligated. That's the main difference, but the point is they're 2 different things. Why does it start off with the language of a neder and move to the language of a nidava? Nidava is really, it's like a gift, you could call it. So nidava, neder hu, karile neder, but karile nidava, right? In other words, it's very strange. They seem to be calling, right? It starts off with a neder, then it calls it a nidava. Ela im kamosha nadarta asita yehe neder. So they say like this. If you do it exactly as you vowed to do, which is bring it lishma, then it'll be a neder. V'im lav yehe nidava. If not, it morphs into something else. Meaning, it then just becomes a gift. It's not fulfilling an obligation, but it's a gift. And turning now to Amabed, unidava mishari l'shinuyeba. Now, once we call it a nidava, well, a nidava has its own rules. You have to bring a nidava to the temple. You can't mess things up along the way. So once we basically say a neder that's not brought properly becomes a nidava, well, then, of course, it has to be done according to the rules of a nidava, which, again, have to be lishma and all that. You can't just mess it up at that point. So we have a proof. Okay, what we did so far is we explained in the Mishna what can be done, that is brought within the world of mincha. Which menachot are brought that if you do them, they're kasher. You keep going through the process, which we now just derived means, and you go through the process correctly all along the way. That's the word El is coming to teach you. But the owner has to replace it, the original promise with something else because he didn't or she didn't fulfill their obligation by bringing that offering, but it is sacrificed as opposed to the other 2 exceptions to the rule, the minchat choteh, the minchat knaot, which are completely disqualified if they're done shelo lishma. That's part 1 of the sugya. Part 2 of the sugya, and this did not happen in Zvachim, is that now the Gemara brings and mentions that there's some alternative opinion here. Okay, we're going to see exactly what this alternative opinion disagrees with. But the Gemara is going to start off with a kind of question. Lema manitin deloka Rabbi Shimon. Are you going to say then our Mishnah doesn't seem to match Rabbi Shimon? Because look at what Rabbi Shimon says. Ditanya. Rabbi Shimon omer. Kol ha-menachot shenikmetzu shelo lishman kshirot. So far, that's the same. Okay, any mincha that was nikmat shelo lishma, you did the kemitza not for the right intent of the wrong korban, basically. Kshirot, they're kosher. But get ready for the next words. Ve'alu leba'alim l'shem chova. And actually, you can fulfill your obligation with it. Okay, that is completely different from our Mishnah. It makes sense that the Gemara says, seems like Rabbi Shimon disagrees with our Mishnah. Let's continue on and hear Rabbi Shimon in this Breita before we start to deal with it. He explains, why didn't he say the same thing in Zvachim? She'ein ha-menachot omot l'zvachim. First of all, it's very interesting because we're already getting, you can see what they're doing here. They're setting up the comparisons to Menachot. In what ways are they, Menachot and Zvachim, in what ways are they similar? Like the first Mishnah, really. And Rabbi Shimon saying, in what ways are they different? And in what ways, not just halachically are they different, but inherently they're different. So he says, well, let's look at the differences. Shakometz machvat l'shemor cheshet. If I take a kometz, right, of the Kohen, takes his handful, says, I'm doing, right, it's supposed to be in a pan, the flat pan, and instead you say you're doing it l'shem marcheshet, the deep pan, but when he actually does the mincha, what's he going to do with it? Where's he going to put the kometz? In the deep pan, in the flat pan, because it's a flat pan offering. The only thing that's messed up here is his thoughts, right? His thoughts, whether expressed or not expressed, okay? But let's say he expresses them. Let's go with Rashi. So the Kohen's standing there. He says, I'm doing this kemitza in order to put it in the deep pan. But in another minute, where's he going to put it? In the flat pan. So comes Rabbi Shimon and he says, Ma'aseh mochichim ala l'shum achvat. His actions a minute later or 5 minutes later prove that he didn't really mean anything when he said he's going to put it in the deep pan, because in the end he puts it in the flat pan. So that's not a machshava that can disqualify, because it's a machshava that so clearly he didn't mean. It's a very strange way to look at it, okay? And that's why this is Rabbi Shimon's opinion, not necessarily the rabbi's opinion, although we're going to have to see, maybe it is. But basically, we're going to say that because the actions, and we're going to see why this is not the same in a korban. Okay, let's just see another example. There's different korbanot, like I said, korban minchas. Some of them have oil in them, some of them don't have oil in them. So if you do one that's supposed to be dry without oil, and then you say, well, I'm doing it to mix it with oil, for the sake of a korban that's mixed with oil, and then you don't mix it with oil, it was clear. Some commentators even say it was a machshavat sheker. It was basically a lie. That's not something that could ruin, right? When you say something totally ridiculous, right, and that you don't mean, and it's clear you don't mean it, well, you can't mess things up by saying something so wrong. And since your actions clearly prove that that wasn't what your intent was, that for some reason you said it or thought it, if we go with just thoughts, but it's obvious that you meant to do it the right way, and therefore it's completely valid. Why in Zvachim is this not the case? So Rabbi Shimon continues to explain. B'Zvachim in okay. Shchita achat lekulam. There's no difference the way you slaughter this animal or that animal for a chata, for an ola, for a shlamim. They're all slaughtered in the same way. Zrika achat lekulan. You sprinkle the blood in the same way. Now, that's not exactly true. Okay, we learned there's different sprinklings for all the different korbanot. But the fact is that if you did just one instead of two that are four, or four, all that, we said in the end they're all valid. So since basically, when you do the sprinkling of the blood, if you just did one or you just did it really could fulfill your obligation for any korban, so your actions don't prove that it's wrong. But if I do the machvad and a marcheshet, that's completely wrong, right? That's different. That's clear. Those are two completely different actions. But sprinkling the blood is basically the same action. And kabbalah chad lekulam, and putting the blood in the sanctified vessel, it's done the same for all the korbanot. So only in a mincha can you say this. And that's why Rabbi Shimon has this different approach in mincha. Now, the complicated part of this sugya is that right now, the sugya is going to kind of assume that you read the end of the daf before you read the beginning of the daf. Okay? Or before you read this part of the daf. So I'm going to stop for a brief minute in the structure here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you on the sheet what we're going to read in a bit, okay, which is this other bright of Rabbi Shimon. What we're going to try now to do. Now, the question was, is our Mishnah a lot like Rabbi Shimon? And it basically seemed like our Mishnah is not like Rabbi Shimon. But they're going to say, well, it really depends how you understand Rabbi Shimon. And there's a whole contradiction between what Rabbi Shimon says in the Breita that we saw, which is on the second chart of the page, okay, to another Breita Rabbi Shimon says. So we're going to read it now inside. Okay, we'll read it. You can follow along on the chart here, or you can skim down to lower in the page, and then we'll read it again when we get there. But it's very hard to learn the sugya without learning this first, so we're going to go learn it first. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Kodesh Kodashimi Kachata Kasham. He quotes a pasuk about the mincha. This is where we see the mincha is a Kodesh Kodashim. It's a high-level sanctity, like the chatat and like the asham. Now, it could have just said kachatat, and you would have known it's high-level sanctity. Why do you have to say also like a sin offering, also like a guilt offering? Because it wants to teach you, Rabbi Shimon says, Yesh mehem kachatat veyesh mehem kasham. Some of them are like a chatat, some of them are like an asham. Now, let's go back to the first Mishna in Zvachim, if you remember. So what did we say? All the korbanot that are brought to lo lishma are ksherot, other than the minchat, than the chatat. Okay, if you might remember, Rabbi Eliezer there says asham and chatat are the same, but this is going by the main opinion, which is that asham is going to be, valid if it was done lo lishma, but it's not going to fulfill the obligation. That's what we're going to say right now. Minchat chotei arei kechatat. So which one is like the sin offering? The sin offering, right? The minchat chotei, the sliding scale that we talked about. Leficha kemitza shelo lishma psula kechatat. Okay, therefore it's completely disqualified if you did shelo lishma. Minchat nidava, but a voluntary offering, harehi kasham. Leficha kemitza shelo lishma kshera. And so therefore if you did shelo lishma, it actually is valid. Now, you would expect, this is Rabbi Shimon, what would he say? And the owner to fulfill their obligation. But that's not what he says. He says, uche asham. And it's completely like an asham in the sense that, ma asham kashir ve'eno meratzeh, af minchat nedavak shera ve'eno meratzah. Just like the asham does not fulfill the obligation for the owner, this one also doesn't. So now we have a complete contradiction between Rabbi Shimon. One place he says it actually fulfills the obligation. The other place he says it doesn't fulfill the obligation. Well, we're going to see later that there's three solutions to this problem. Rava, Rava, and Ravashi. And the order is chronological. That's the way these sugyot are organized. Chronological order, who said what first. Okay? So, Rava comes and says, and I'm going to go through all these answers and then we'll go back to them later. Rava says, let's resolve, and then we're going to say, basically, we're going to try to see, do these resolutions fit into the contradiction between our Mishna and Rabbi Shimon? And if we explain it that way, then they actually don't disagree. Because they agree, they're each just trying about different situations. Just like Rabbi Shimon doesn't say the same thing in the opposite. He just must be talking about different situations. So Rava says there's a difference between Shinoi Kodesh and Shinoi Baalim, which you might remember. Right? One is doing it for the sake of the wrong korban, which is what we've been talking about. And that's Rabbi Shimon in the first Breita that we saw, where he says you could fulfill your obligation. And the other is if you had intent to do it because the Maaseh HaMochichim, that was his whole point. Once you do it the other way, it's going to be obvious that's what you meant. Against the other option is Shinoi Baalim, which is instead of bringing it for you, the Kohen has intent to bring it for somebody else. Now that, when the Kohen does all the actions, it makes no difference whether they're doing it for me or they're doing it for you, right? So there's no issue of Maaseh HaMochichim, and there basically is going to say, oh yeah, well the owner can't fulfill their obligation because it was done by Shinoi Baalim. That's Rava. Rava says, in one case, you were kemitza mincha l'shum mincha. You did this mincha for a different mincha offering. And comes Rav and he says, based on the pasuk, zot Torah mincha, which means basically, right, we ended our Masechet yesterday or 2 days ago with zot Torah shlamim, right? Everything is all the same. So here, zot Torah mincha, Torah l'chol menachot, all menachot are really one category. Okay, that's what he says. Whereas if you're kometz mincha l'shum zevach, there's no pasuk that says zot Torah mincha v'azevach. So if you say, I'm doing this mincha for the sake of an animal offering, okay, that's definitely not going to work, right? So again, it'll be kosher, but you won't fulfill your obligation. So again, two different situations. And the last one is Ravashi. Ravashi says, it depends the way you worded it. Okay, now this sort of proves a little more Rashi's position, that you actually had to have said it in words, because the wording is what's important. If you said, I'm kometz machvat l'shem marcheshet, okay, I'm taking a pan, right, a thing that was meant for a flat pan, and I'm doing it for in a deep pan. You just said, I'm taking, instead of doing this pan, I'm using this pan. Okay, or you didn't say instead of. You just said, I'm using a deep pan, and then a minute later you take the flat pan. Okay, so Ravashi says, all you're talking about is a vessel. Deep pan, flat pan. Okay, it doesn't matter. There's no disqualification thought in talking about a pan. But if you said, I'm kometz minchat machvat, you said, I'm going to do the kometz here right now, I'm doing it for the mincha called the mincha machvat, and instead of doing it for the mincha machvat, I'm actually doing it for the mincha marcheshet, then you've disqualified it because you use the language of mincha. Okay? So if you're just saying, I'm using the wrong pan, that doesn't disqualify. If you're saying, I'm doing right now a mincha marcheshet when it was really a mincha machvat, that's a problem. So those are three different ways of resolving this contradiction. The question is, can we implement the same difference for our Mishnah and Rabbi Shimon? And that's the first chart on the page. So the Gemara is going to say like this. So is our Mishnah not like Rabbi Shimon? And we read the whole Brite of Rabbi Shimon. Now the Gemara is going to say, Hanicha le Rav Ashi, Da'amal kam bekometz machvat l'shum marcheshet, kam bekometz minchat machvat l'shum minchat marcheshet. Right, that was the distinction we just made. According to Rav Ashi, we could explain our Mishnah in light of Rabbi Shimon and say it all fits in. Because Rabbi Shimon, according to Rav Ashi, was only talking about if you said kometz machvat l'shum marcheshet. He was just talking about the vessels. Okay? And our Mishnah was talking about, I did a mincha of this for the wrong mincha offering. And then it won't work for the owners, and then they all fit together. So matnite mincha l'shum minchahi. Okay, so again, right? There, what Rabbi Shimon, the way we explain the second Braita, we can explain our Mishnah. Okay? And then it all works together. Ela l'Rava v'Rava ma'ika l'meimar. But Rava and Rava's explanation of the two, resolving the contradiction between Braita 1 and Braita 2 of Rabbi Shimon, can't fit into the Mishnah. And let's see why. So let's go again. Okay, what did Rava say? Rava said that Shinoi Baalim is the way we explain the second Braita, which doesn't work for the owners. So we'll say that's our Mishnah, where you change the owner. Okay? And that's why it doesn't work for the owner, whereas Rabbi Shimon was talking about where you changed the type of korban. Okay, that definitely can't be the way to read the Mishnah, because the one difference between our Mishnah and the Braita, the second Braita of Rabbi Shimon, was the second Braita of Rabbi Shimon just said, sometimes like an Asham, and it works, but it doesn't fulfill the obligation. But it didn't give an example. Our Mishnah gave an example. What did it say? How is it done lishman with shelo lishman? It said l'shem minchat chotei u l'shem minchat nedava. Okay, and presumably that's a case where it's disqualified, but presumably it would be the same. When we talked about any mincha that's kemitza shelo lishma, it would be the same kind of thing. So you can't possibly read that as shinoi baalim, because hamanijin shinoi kodeshu. It's clearly that you change the type of mincha offering you were going to offer, because it says it explicitly. The katani ketzad lishma b'shelo lishma lishum minchat chotei lishum minchat nedava. It doesn't say lishum Ruven and instead Shimon, or lishum, right, this person, and you did it for that person. That's not what it says. It says specifically you changed the type of korban. And that's the way he explained Rabbi Shimon, which means that according to Rava, definitely Rabbi Shimon does not fit with the Mishnah. Inami k'dikmashani Rava, and we're going to have the same problem with Rava. How did Rava distinguish? He said either you did a mincha for a mincha, and then it would completely work, or you did a mincha for accidentally, right, in the name of an animal sacrifice. Well, for sure, again, that doesn't match the wording of our Mishnah. You can't say that's the case on the Mishnah, and that's why it doesn't work to fulfill the obligation for the owner. So again, let's read it inside. Inami k'kamashani Rava, kam b'kometz mincha l'shum mincha, kam b'kometz mincha l'shum zevach, hamaniti mincha l'shum minchai. Our Mishnah is for sure mincha l'shum mincha, which again, according to Rava, that's the case that Rabbi Shimon says completely works. And right? But it can't work for us, because what does it say in our Mishnah? Okay, you took a minchat nedava and you did it in the name of a minchat chote. Okay, that would be a case of shelo lishma, and therefore ela l'Rava v'Rava mechumarta matnitin delo k'Rabbi Shimon. So we end this section with saying, according to Rava and Rava, there's no way to say that the Mishnah works with Rabbi Shimon, and basically we're going to have to say, according to Rava and Rava, there's two completely different opinions here. One is expressed in our Mishnah, and one is expressed in the Braita of Rabbi Shimon, which means that, again, according to Rabbi Shimon, it's an inherent difference between a mincha and a tzvachim, that a mincha offering, if you do it shelo lishma, in a case where it's not disqualified, if it does work, it works completely, and the owner completely fulfills their obligation, whereas the rabbis say no. According to Rav Ashi, we could say, oh no, they were talking about different situations. One was minchat machvat l'shum minchat marcheshet, and the other was a machvat l'shum marcheshet, where all you were talking about was the vessel. And then Rabbi Shimon doesn't disagree. He would actually agree, in this case, that with the Mishna that it wouldn't actually work. What Rav Ashi is really doing, and that's the way we're reading the sugya is really minimizing this big machloket between Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis, according to Rav Ashi, and say there's really no machloket. But if you go with Rabba and Rava, there's a serious machloket here. Is there lishma, right? Is it possible to do it, shelo lishma, and it actually works for the owners? And that's a big chiddush of Rabbi Shimon, if we understand him in that way. Okay, so now we're going to go to the second chart on the page, and now we're going to read inside what I showed you outside. But we're only going to really get to Rabba's explanation today, and we're going to deal with a few difficulties on Rabba's explanation. And then tomorrow we're going to get to Rava and then Rav Ashi. I wanted to point out that the second sugya is organized Rava, Rav Ashi because it's chronological. Our sugya started out with Rav Ashi. That's why I specifically talked about the order, because they wanted to say, oh, you think the Mishnah doesn't match Rabbi Shimon? Well, according to Rav Ashi, it actually does work. And then they went back to Rabba and Rava because it doesn't work to say that. So that's why they started with Rav Ashi, even though the sugya below doesn't. Okay. Rami, to Rabbi Shimon, and here it's going to be basically simple because I already read this. Rabbi Shimon says, Omeo, Kodesh Kodeshimi Kachata Kasham. So they're not bringing you the first braita because we already brought it, where it seems very clear that you're going to actually fulfill your obligation. Second braita says you're not, because again, Kodesh Kodeshimi Kachata Kasham, Yesh Mem Kachata, Yesh Mem Kasham, sometimes it's like a Chata, sometimes it's like a Rasham. If it's lo lishma, minchat chotei arei kechatat, leficha kemitza shelo lishma psulat chatat. So the sin offering of the mincha is like the sin offering of an animal, and therefore it's done shelo lishma, it's disqualified. Minchat nidava harei kasham, leficha kemitza shelo lishma kshera. But a voluntary offering is more like an asham, and therefore if you do it shelo lishma kshera, but it's completely like an asham, uke asham kasher ve'eno meratzeh, av minchat nidava kshera ve'eno meratzeh. Okay, but it doesn't, it doesn't work to fulfill the obligation. Okay. Now the Gemara comes and says, we're going to bring Rava. I'm a Rava. Lo kashya kamashino kodesh kamashino balim. So as we said, if you change which type of offering you were going to do it, so again, your actions prove. But if you change who you were going to do it for, well, your actions don't prove who you're doing it for. It's the same actions whether you do it for someone, right, or someone else, and therefore it's not going to work. Amarle Abaye. Abaye says, I don't understand. Michti machshavet pasar rachmane hekeshehi. If you're learning this from a hekesh, from the asham, and you're just saying it's completely like an asham, mali shino kodesh, mali shino balim. Now, an asham is disqualified whether you change the kodesh, you change which, you say asham for the sake of a chatat, right? Or whether you change the owner. Instead of doing the asham for Ruth, I'm doing the asham for Naomi, right? That's all the same. So if you're going to learn it all from the asham, which is what Rabbi Shimon did, then how can you, Rabbi, explain that he differentiates between Shino Kodesh and Shino Balim? By Asham, there's no differentiation. To which Amarle, and this is a very interesting point, Ma'aseh mochichim deka'amar Rabbi Shimon Sfarahi. Okay, so first of all, right, it's logical argument here, Ma'aseh mochichim, but yet he learned it from a pasuk. So, the Rabbi Shimon Darish Tamid Dekra, and this is famous. Rabbi Shimon likes to darshan the reason for the pasuk. In other words, yes, it's true, we learn it from an Asham, but he doesn't stop there. He says, everyone really tries to come up with explanations, but the question is, can you act upon your logical explanations of the psukim? So he says that he does like to employ logic in the sense that if you say machshava, and yes, we're going to learn it from an asham, but it has to be similar to an asham. So machshava de lo minkara pasar rachmana. So when it's not noticeable, just like in an asham, it wouldn't be noticeable. The Torah is going to disqualifying it. But the comparison only works when it's similar. Machshava de minkara, if it's a noticeable difference, lo pasar rachmana. So therefore, the comparison is only going to be the comparison for Shino Balim, because in Shino Kodesh, again, the actions prove, and therefore Rabbi Shimon takes the comparison, but only where it makes logical sense. Which sometimes is a dangerous game to darshan Talmud Dekra, but that's what he does. Okay, the rest of this chart we're not going to go through today because that's Rava and Rav Ashi, and we're not up to them yet. So now there's a siman for a slew of difficulties we're going to raise on Rava, okay, because we're only in Rava so far. Siman, ola, malak, umitza, chatara, of, koche, koshum, chalim. Okay, that's just a mnemonic. Elame'ata, so we're going to deal with two difficulties today. Elame'ata, ola ta'of, if you say shinoi kodesh, right, if ma'aseh mochichim is the whole thing, and if the actions don't prove, then, it's going to be a problem. If the actions don't prove, then it will be an issue. But if the actions could prove, then it actually will fulfill the obligation. That was right, Shino Kodesh versus Shino Balim. Alameata, olata of shemelaka lemala, mishum chatara of tiratzeh. Okay, now we have to remember all sorts of things we learned in Zvachim. The olata of the burnt offering of the bird you do the malika, the strangling of it. That's the malika. That's the strangulation that you do in the temple. It's not really strangling. It's malika. It's not shchita. I'm sorry. It's a kind of I meant slaughtering. It's the type of slaughtering that you do in the temple. So it's called malika. If you do it on top, mishum chatat ha'of. Now the olat ha'of is supposed to be done at the top. Chatat ha'of is supposed to be done at the bottom. So if you're standing at the top, where it's obvious you're doing it for olat ha'of, this is a classic case of maseh mochichim. Your actions prove you're doing it for an olah. And yet you say you're doing it mishum chatat ha'of. It should work, but it doesn't. We know it's disqualified. Why? The fact that you're standing at the top should prove that it's an olat ha'of. Because if it was a sin offering like you claimed you were doing, and yet, so according to what you're saying, if the actions could prove it, it should be good, but it's not. To which the Gemara answers, what do you mean? You could technically, just like I said with the blood, you're supposed to do the blood in a particular way, but if you did it that way, it works. Same thing, if you take the chatat ha'of, it's supposed to be slaughtered at the bottom next to the altar, but you did it at the top of the altar. They say that malika everywhere is kshera. Okay, the second question we'll leave for tomorrow. We'll stop here. Okay, so the second question kind of comes up on the stuff, but then the answer, it's actually a kind of similar question, but we'll leave it for tomorrow. So again, we saw the exact parallel Mishna of Menachot to Zvachim. We thought it was completely parallel, although we found out when we got to the Gemara that there's a braita, right? Besides that, the Gemara added this Ella and wanted to teach you this other halacha. You have to do the rest of it the way it's supposed to be done. But the central part of today's stuff is really this opinion of Rabbi Shimon, which seems to be coming out of left field, all of a sudden saying, oh, by the way, mincha is not like Zvachim, and if you do it Shalosh Shema, it actually could fulfill the obligation. And then we said, depending on how you resolve this contradiction of Rabbi Shimon to himself, where he actually says the opposite somewhere else, well, there were three ways to resolve, depending on which way you looked at it. It could be that you could explain Rabbi Shimon together with our Mishnah, just like you explain Rabbi Shimon with the other braita that contradicted. Or, according to some of them, it might be that you could resolve the contradiction between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Shimon in that way, but you can't necessarily resolve our Mishnah in that way, because our Mishnah actually expressed that we're talking about a minchat machvat, or minchat nedava, l'shem minchat chatat, or the reverse. It would seem very clear you're not talking about shino ba'alim, and you're not talking about mincha l'shem zevach. So two of those answers really didn't work, in which case we have two tracks. Either Rabbi Shimon really does disagree with our Mishnah, or maybe Rabbi Shimon actually could work in with our Mishnah. And then we just went into the contradiction. We got to the first opinion, the first resolution of Rava, and we're in the middle of a slew of questions, of difficulties raised against Rava's position. That we finished for today. Welcome to Masechet Menachot, and we'll pick up from here tomorrow. Wishing everyone a good day.